the environment is getting degraded because people are poor, right? Because people need the resources in ways that are exploitive. So if we continue to just restore the environment and not worry about the poverty, then we're going to end up in the same place where we are. So we need to both address the people element, the poverty, and the environment in order for the whole system to be restored. We're in the system whether we want to think of it as a system or not. So let's start thinking about it holistically.
Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, I'll be talking to Dr. Annah Amani, the Africa Programs Director for Plant with Purpose. From past episodes, you might know that Plant with Purpose is a global environmental nonprofit organization working to address the interconnected challenges of global poverty and environmental damage. Their aim is to restore the regenerative relationship between people and the natural environment so that all beings in the community of creation, human and non-human, might thrive together. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Anna, welcome to the podcast. I'm hoping that you can help us understand a bit about you by telling us about your current role with Plant with Purpose as a programs manager in Africa.
Absolutely. My role is to directly work with our country partners. All of our countries have native teams, so we don't really have expats or anyone that's not from the area and from the country that is working in our program. So my job is to be a liaison between the U.S. team and our Africa partners.
And the reason you can stand in that position, I'm assuming, is because you actually have roots in both places. You live in San Diego, and you also have a history of growing up in Uganda. Is that correct?
Yes, I actually immigrated to the U.S. as a child refugee at the age of 8. And I grew up in the L.A. area, and I went back into development work. 2007 is when I went back into Africa.
We at Earth Keepers are unapologetic fans of Plant with Purpose. We love your approach in great part because it takes into consideration that the ecology, the local environment, is actually part of community when it comes to community development. And I just think that is so exemplary. And we'll talk a bit later about whether and how that might actually be shifting in the broader development world. But first, for folks who aren't really familiar with Plant with Purpose and their work, could you help us understand what the organization does and maybe even give us an exemplary story that helps us to understand the ethos and values of Plant with Purpose?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. And I'm an unapologetic fan of our model. How about that? Which includes the 3 elements of environmental restoration, economic development, and the spiritual renewal part. And I think that is a critical element in helping people align their minds and their beliefs with the work that they're doing. And it is part of the secret sauce, I think, of what makes it work. If I were to give a recent example from Ethiopia, I met a man who has been lame his whole life. He had issues with his legs and couldn't walk, and so he was dependent on begging and the kindness of family and strangers before he joined the Plant with Purpose program. And now he has his own business doing traditional embroidery. They have very intricate embroidery that they put on their clothes that's significant for when you get married or when you're a young girl. So it's significant to their culture and their heritage. So that's being preserved by him being able to actually do this for people. And he's making a living. And now he has his own place and is supporting himself and is saving money. And he started another business of selling shoes and just some other income generating activities that he's able to do and be completely independent, which is such a breakthrough, right? I think development can be difficult in rural areas, but there are particular groups that are very vulnerable, including the disabled. There's like no programs for them. There's really nothing for them to turn to in order to try and be independent, have their own life. So for me, that just shows the holistic nature of our program, that it is able to bring in the most vulnerable and raise their standard of living substantially.
Well, I love that you told that particular story because it brings up something I think might surprise people, and that is Plant with Purpose doesn't only work with agroforestry and farming. That development is, as you say, much more holistic, and you may not have any connection in a particular project to the environment. Is that a correct read?
Well, I don't know if I would say any connection, because overall that is an element of our program. So we're continuously teaching people about their relationship to creation. They may not, well, they will likely plant trees. I don't know if they may not have an agroforestry plot. That is true. But they will likely help with the community tree planting and learn about their place in creation as part of our creation care curriculum.
Now, I love that term, relationship with creation. It's not a term you will hear from all that many people in the development world, and yet it's primary for Plant with Purpose. Can you talk more about that? What do you mean by relationship to creation, and how do you encourage that awareness of connectedness?
Yes, well, part of why I went back to school to get my PhD is that I realized that in rural Africa, we were teaching people away from being tenants of the land. Basically, the school system is like, you get an education and you get a job in some urban industrialized area, which is not true for most Africans. 70 to 80% of Africans live in the rural area. And so people end up feeling very down on themselves, low self-esteem about being a farmer, and they're not really contributing, like it's the backwards thing to do. And so we're helping to reverse that narrative. You know, God was the original farmer, and being caretakers of the land is a tremendous contribution to society. We all eat and we all need to eat, and being able to feed people and restore creation. Part of what we're called to do as Christians is to be caretakers of creation. And so we reintroduced that narrative, and we found people were very, and so I think it really brings in the soul and their beliefs, restoring that original dignity and honor that it is to take care of the land.
This raises a question in my mind. We talk to folks on the podcast who represent indigenous traditions, indigenous cultures, and their claim is that the Western value system really encourages separation from creation. And indigenous traditions are resources of wisdom and knowledge and maybe new ways of thinking and being in relationship to the environment. I'm wondering if you also hold to that idea. And if that's the case, are there indigenous traditions in Uganda in particular, we'll just use that as an example, that you think we could learn from, that we benefit in the West to listen to?
Absolutely. I believe in general, at least from my knowledge and from my understanding, that the indigenous beliefs are, for the most part, preserving, right? They promote a balance of how much one should take and how much one should use, and a respect and a balance that's just not there. That's not really, creation is here for us, but we're a part of creation. And so we work in harmony. If I were to think of a specific example from our Ankole culture, I mean, I would say every household has their own banana garden. That's also just all their food. Most of their food comes from there. So they'll plant green bananas, which is our staple food, but they also plant beans and groundnuts and vegetables. And every household has that. So every household has a level of sustaining themselves in a way that is not exploiting the land. That's not exploitive of the land. It is actually restorative to the land. And those gardens are maintained for generations and generations. So that would be an example of how by our culture we're taught to live harmoniously and respect what the land provides for us in terms of being able to live a healthy life.
And these gardens aren't necessarily being maintained by farmers. People may work in many different sectors of society, but regardless, many of them have gardens then in their home or by their home.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Yeah, they would. Not just many of them, all of them would. Just now recently is when people have begun to depend on going to the market for food. But traditionally, you would keep your own garden and then you would trade with your neighbors or within your community, whatever you needed. If I have a cow and you have tomatoes, let's say, I give you milk for tomatoes. I mean, that's how that would work instead of going to market.
So there's even a community dimension to this ethos of having gardens by your house.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Absolutely.
I have a friend in Uganda, Robert Katende, and he lives in Kampala, but we were in Lira, and he was obviously really frustrated as we were walking through the town. And I asked him why. And he said, look at this. And he was pointing to the new medians next to the road, the green spaces. Mm-hmm. And apparently someone had planted London plane trees in them, which I guess are a good median tree because they are drought tolerant, etc. But he said, this space could be used to produce fruit. These trees should be fruit trees. They should be available to all. And I just thought that's really a different way of thinking, right? Whoever put those plane trees in, which really serve no purpose other than ornamental,
right,
was thinking differently. But Robert had this sensibility that the common spaces are for the people as well.
And that's a traditional value.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really interested to understand how your personal story connects with your work with Plant with Purpose and development work in general. Tell us a bit about how you grew up and where you grew up and maybe how that has led to where you are right now in terms of the work you do.
So I talked about being a child refugee. My family immigrated from Uganda around the early 80s. That time, probably I was about 8 years old. And we had a very intense refugee story. My parents came. They were literally like, if you don't get on the plane right now, they will catch you. They will find you and they will kill you. My father was at that time supporting Museveni, who's the current president and has been the president for a long time in Uganda. But the powers that be at that time were fighting, obviously. He was a guerrilla warrior. And so they left, and they left us with my father's brother, our uncle, and then they came for him. And he was killed at some point in that process. But when my father heard that his brother was captured and they didn't know where we were, he had a psychological breakdown and was admitted. And at that time, an Episcopalian church in Granada Hills read the story. Someone had written a special interest story. This man and his wife, they're looking for his children. They don't know where they are. And so they read the story and they decided that they were going to help us, that they were going to help my mother and father to reunite with us. And we had been the children for whatever reason, or, well, I think it's, God and our guardian angels working on our behalf. Whoever came from my uncle, he didn't have the heart to kill children or capture children. And so we were smuggled out by another church group in Uganda, and we were smuggled into Kenya. And so that's where we were. We were living with some church members in Kenya, and they got Amnesty International involved, and they found us and were able to reunite us with our parents here in the Los Angeles area. So from that point on, I grew up in Los Angeles. I went to school in Los Angeles. I got my undergrad at Cal State University Northridge, my master's at UCLA, and then I got my PhD in South Carolina. So somewhere in between there, I started out in for-profit healthcare, and then I knew that's not what I wanted to do with my life energy, and I really wanted to go into nonprofit work. And so someone said, you should study public health because that's something that is really needed on the continent. I really wanted to work with Africa and development, and that over time formulated itself into what I really wanted to do. Because once I got my master's in public health degree, I went back and I worked with a child sponsorship program. And that's when I saw so many efforts that were, I think, well-intentioned, but not really effective. And so I really wanted to work with a model that was going to be development-oriented, was going to be effective, was going to be sustainable, was going to be owned by the people of wherever that is, right? So it's very context-specific, that they're able to speak into it and they're able to own it, and it's really a true partnership with the community and not just like an out-of-the-box solution, which is what most people are doing. They're like, we should do this. And they bring it and they put it wherever, and it doesn't necessarily work for that context. So that's what I was really interested in studying for my PhD. My PhD was actually around the concept of self-determination. How do people really decide to like change or transform their lives? The self-determination theory talks about people will choose the things that give them the most autonomy, that they feel somehow related to, and that they have some competence in what it is that they're doing. And I felt when I decided to look for program work, I had gone into academia and was doing like funded program work. So when I decided I really wanted to be more on the program side, but still be able to connect, have my academic links. Part of what's really attractive about Plant with Purpose is they are very committed to the science and collecting the impact data. And is it really working? How do we know this? And so all of that was very attractive to me. I didn't want to be in academia for academia's sake, which can be so many of the publications that come out are read by very few elite academics and don't really filter down to impacting the people. And I was very much about the people. And so that worked out for me ideally.
So you had mentioned this observation on your part that there were a lot of ways that development was being done that you didn't think were either right or effective. I think that was part of your motivation to go back to doctoral study. What is it about your work now that stands against those things that made you uncomfortable about development work status quo?
I think that being true partners, we think of our participants as partners, not projects, right? So we're leveraging the knowledge that we all have together, which is part of that. Do we have indigenous techniques? Do we have indigenous ways of doing this that can help us get to the same point, right? In ways, it's easier to have, an out-of-the-box solution and say, this is our solution, run it. But when you get into it and you're able to talk to the people and have the input, it takes longer. It's much more about the process. And it can be difficult to describe. Are you an environmental organization? Are you a Christian organization? Are you an economic development? And I think the reason it's difficult to describe, and part of also what I had a multidisciplinary development degree, is that it's just not that simple. It's just not about the money, or just not about planting trees, or just not about sharing Christianity. It's all of these things together, and it's multifaceted. It's complex, as poverty is complex. And so I think that true ownership and that element of graduation, I think our communities graduate from the program and are expected to maintain that high level, that new level of development, and spread it throughout their community.
I have another friend in Uganda, Edward Olara, and I spoke to him recently, and we had done a development conference in Lira, and basically we're aiming the whole thing at indigenous developers, like Ugandans and some Rwandans as well. But it was so interesting to hear their reaction to what we were teaching. And we were advocating for some of the things you're talking about, where you listen to local context and local knowledge. You trust people in the community to know the solutions to their challenges better than any outside foreign entity. Their point to me, and this is where it was a learning experience for me, was that yes, organizations from the West will often come in assuming that their solution is the best one, don't take the time necessarily to ask the questions or do the work of contextualization. But their point was it works both ways, that there are things built into the culture and society which make it easier not to resist, make it easier to go along with that system where the foreign entities set the agenda. And that was a new thing for me. And I'm wondering what your take on that is. What is it about, say, history or culture context that feeds into that dynamic that essentially disrespects people in their own country, their own context when it comes to designing solutions to challenges?
I mean, yes, that's part of what I was talking about earlier in what motivated me to get my PhD is that, that whole orientation is around this very linear idea of development. You're here now, and you're going to go here, and then you're going to go there, and we're all going towards this industrialized mecca, for lack of a better word. But we know that that's not what we actually want. We don't actually want that. We don't want the developing world to start consuming at the levels of the developed world. That's going to be catastrophic for everybody. We want to set a whole new line, a whole new path to development that respects nature. And the reason, part of what's fascinating about working with the countries that I'm working with now is that I'm also working with Ethiopia. And Ethiopia was occupied but never colonized. And you can definitely see the difference in their assertion of their knowledge in how they operate. And I think the colonized nations were all conditioned to be like the outside world better. The European way is the best. All our textbooks tell us that. And we've been told that. My name, people are like, well, what's your real name? I mean, my native name is Kamjizire Mpangare. And that was not sufficient. In the year that I was born, I also had to have a Europeanized name in order to be able to join school or get baptized. And so that's why I have Annah. But just that basic level, and I see that in Ethiopia, they all have their native, traditional, indigenous Ethiopian names. And just something like that, which seems really superficial, but is really not. It's very profound. It's a very profound identity change that was forced upon us and is part of us disregarding our indigenous ways, language, our thinking, basically, and being it subverted to European ways of doing and thinking.
Hello, Earth Keepers. This is Christine Syme, curator of the blog God Space Light. On behalf of the Earth Keepers podcast, I want to invite you all to a free webinar coming up this month, May 24th at 7 p.m. Pacific Time. James Amadon and Forrest Inslee will be having a conversation with Deborah Reinstra about her new book, Refugee of Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelters, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth. This book explores how Christian spirituality and practice must adapt to prepare for life on a climate-altered planet. Refugia is a biological term describing places of shelter where life endures in times of crisis, such as a volcanic eruption, fire, or stressed climate. Ideally, these refugia endure, expand, and connect so that new life emerges. Dr. Reinstra applies this concept to human culture and faith, asking, in this era of ecological devastation, how can we become people of refugia? How can we find and nurture these refugia, not only in the biomes of the earth, but in our human cultural systems and in our spiritual lives? How can we apply all our love and creativity to this task as never before? Reinstra recounts her own process of re-education, examining the wisdom of theologians and philosophers, farmers and nature writers, scientists and activists, and especially people on the margins. So, be sure to register for this free event using the link in this episode's show notes or by going directly to our website at circlewood.online. Again, that's May 24th at 7 p.m. Pacific Time. Hope to see you there.
The nonprofit community is so infatuated with the word empowerment. And I say, can we really say we've empowered people? Only a person can tell you whether they feel empowered by what you did, because maybe what you're doing is actually making them dependent on you and not at all empowered in themselves. And so what we hear over and over again is that people, their eyes are open to the power that they have within the community to affect change and transform their communities and maintain it and help other people. That's one of the questions that one of our impacts is that our participants are much more likely to have helped other people within that previous period of the survey.
So I'm a professor of community development in a graduate program, Northwest University, and our students at one point a number of years ago, we were grappling with that same dilemma with that word empowerment. It works sometimes, but sometimes it's just not the right word at all, especially because it kind of suggests a top-down dynamic, right? A one-way power from one to another. So we actually created a new word, which we continue to use now, and that is copowerment. So that power, quote unquote, flows both ways, right? So the developer, quote unquote, from the West needs the folks that he or she is working with just as much as they need them. That's the ideal dynamic.
Right.
Yeah, so it sounds like that's what you're talking about.
That's just exactly what I'm talking about. And it's not, here we come to save the day. It's kind of like, here we are, let's discuss how we can get to where we're all going together. And my ideas may not work, and we'll hear the ideas. And actually, we tend to defer to the ideas within the community as the best way forward, and the key stakeholders having the knowledge to make it work.
So this is why we hold up Plant with Purpose in the program as an exemplary organization. So we actually know quite a lot about you. My students study your work.
That's great.
So yeah, but I would say one other strength that I would point out about Plant with Purpose is this focus on environment, on ecology. And it seemed to me that as the discussion about climate crisis has become more frequent and those crises are impacting the developing world more severely, my students are having to pay attention to those issues. It's not a possibility anymore to ignore issues of environmental justice, for example. I am wondering if you see that as a wave of impending change that is happening among development organizations, or have people just not caught up to that reality yet?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I always say I came to Plant with Purpose for the people, but now I love the trees. And that's part of my learning curve on just how impactful integration of the environmental piece really is. I think, I was more thinking of a traditional development track. I read the model and I was like, well, the environment makes sense, right? We need to also be paying attention to the environment. But bringing the whole thing together, I think we're seeing more and more people tuning in to the idea that it has to be a part of it. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. It can't be sustainable if we're not taking care of where we actually all live together.
Can you give us an example or two of projects that you're connected with or have observed in the Plant with Purpose sphere that illustrate that connection between environmental ecology awareness and community development?
I think what we're seeing in the DRC and Tanzania and even Burundi is that they are bringing people along to this agenda. So it starts out as a grassroots, but then the government see it and the communities see it and the churches see it and the schools see it. And soon everybody is really engaged and active on that front, which wasn't the case when we were entering into these communities.
So if you look around to say some of the other organizations that you see working in those contexts, how far along are they in getting it, as it were? At least, from the organizational standpoint, do you think that that is a change that's coming? I mean, I asked this question, I have an agenda, I'll be honest with you. And I know that I want to be teaching my students how to be ready for the real world, right? And
Right.
climate change is the real world, and it impacts
Yes.
countries in Africa, for example, far more than it does in the global north. And I want to know what I should be doing to prepare them better. What should I be teaching? That's really what I'm after. And I'm just not sure yet if the world of development organizations is there quite.
Yeah, I want academia to move more aggressively. I feel like it's happening already, but towards this multidisciplinary approach. I feel like academia has been too siloed. Like, this person is learning about the environment, and that person is about development, and now this person is learning about health. We need to be looking at a multidisciplinary approach that incorporates all of those pieces. So people have that knowledge that it's going to take this type of approach to really make a difference. And I'll point out a partnership that we have with Hope International that speaks to the idea that people are tuning in to the environmental piece. And, Hope International also works with churches, also does economic development, but the piece that we're helping them with is the agroforestry and the environmental restoration. And we very much want to be a resource in that way when people see it. I think the Hope communities, we're seeing the Plant with Purpose community and say, we also want to do that. We also need that. And so that's how that all came together. We happen to have a generous funder that also saw that as something that would be beneficial and so brought us together. So yeah, I think people are tuning into it. More and more will move towards that direction.
Can you illustrate that term agroforestry? Because it is such an important concept in the Plant with Purpose sphere. Give us an example of what that looks like on the ground.
Well, currently it looks, and I got the opportunity to go to one of our oldest programs in the Dominican Republic. And there you can see the mature agroforestry vision. These are actual forests where people grow food. That's what I would say. At the most mature level is you're seeing an actual forest where people can also grow food. And I think in our younger programs, it starts with growing trees. So you grow fruit trees, or we try to promote native species. And that looks maybe more like a farm with trees, right? More like what you would see a traditional farm. But now they have trees, and they're doing composting, and they're using natural fertilizer. So it's a long game. We've been in the Dominican for 30 years, and now we're able to see that forest where food is grown. So it's the full spectrum of the timeline that we are, but that's what we're aiming for, is for people to be able to see that that is a sustainable way of living.
Well, I'm interested when you talked about the progression really that was implied in your answer, that you start out with something pretty basic, planting maybe food trees, right?
Yeah.
But when you get to the example in the Dominican Republic, it's about more than food production.
Right.
It almost sounds like it's about more than human needs, right? If you're paying attention to the watershed, for example, you're paying attention to native species, as you put it, it seems to me that you have to really have a mind shift in terms of what you're about in maintaining this land. It's not just about maximizing production of food. It's about something else. Is that something else that people naturally gravitate toward, this sort of sense of responsibility for earth keeping? Or is that something that really has to be taught?
I think where we are now, it has to be encouraged. I feel like we can all inherently feel it. Like, this is why we're attracted to going camping or going out in nature. We can all inherently feeling the restorative elements of nature. But right now it has to be encouraged. People have to reach a level of competence. What I talked about earlier, competence, relatedness, and autonomy, is they have to reach a level of competence in how that all fits together. I'll give a specific. The uniqueness of our Ethiopia programs is that they have that within the Orthodox Church, the idea of a sacred forest. So these churches were maintaining these sacred forests for generations. And over time, they started to get encroached on, But as we were working with them, they're also pushing back out, and people are giving land back to the church, and people are planting. They're expanding the area of the sacred forest, and we're seeing native species come back, and we're seeing birds and animals, things that had become rare, come back into those sacred spaces. And that's what we ultimately want, is to create that balance where flora, fauna, people can all thrive.
It makes me wonder if, in some ways, it's an easier task to help people to develop an earthkeeping sensibility in those contexts than it might be, say, in the industrialized West. And this is a question, really, but I'm guessing it's because they are closer to their indigenous values, right? They haven't been separated so far from them that they're not recoverable. Do you think that's true?
They're closer to their indigenous values, but they're also closer to the consequences, right? So when weather patterns change for us in California, what does that mean? Maybe I have to wear a jacket. Maybe it's raining too hard. But what I'm saying, in the rural area, in the farming communities, they're not going to make the harvest. They're not going to know when to plant. They're not going to have enough food to eat. It's very real in the consequences.
Yeah.
They may not have the climate change lingua, but they understand, and they can talk about what's happening and what they're seeing.
Yeah, that's such a good point.
Yeah.
So Anna, I really want to get your take on this idea of reparations that came out of the COP27 UN conference. The idea behind it is that even though most countries in the global south have little responsibility in causing climate change, these countries often suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change. So there is the idea that wealthier nations ought to be paying money to these companies, both in terms of reparation, but also to help them to maybe mitigate the worst effects of climate change and to prevent certain kinds of damage and suffering. I'm wondering what you make of that. Does that actually represent environmental justice? What do you think is the potential for that movement right now?
I mean, I don't know if money is the solution. I think we need to change the narrative all over. We should change our global narrative in ways that value the environment. We cannot continue to consume at the level that we're consuming and promote the consumption that we're promoting and then just pay out to the developing nations. I don't think that's going to work. We need to work on a solution that fundamentally changes our narrative on how we relate with our environment.
And I'm assuming when you say our, you're talking about the whole world.
Yep.
So the West has a lot of changing to do.
Yeah. And of course, the West is the one that's setting the narrative, right? The developing nations are kind of just having to deal with whatever comes out because of the power structure, the hierarchy. But we need to work on fundamentally changing the narrative for everybody.
Does Plant with Purpose actually do much of that work in the West, that sort of recasting, reimagining the narrative?
What's next for me is working on something that helps us to start influencing and defining and putting our voice into what that narrative is.
It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? You guys have the track record, you have access to the stories. Yeah,
we have the data and, it's working. We know that it's working in big ways.
Yeah.
So I very much want us to get into that space and start talking about it.
Well, we are all for it. If there's any way that Circlewood and Earthkeepers can support that, we will stand behind you. I totally agree with your position there. Well, let me ask this. When one seeks to remain aware of the needs of the global poor and the needs of the non-human element of creation at the same time, I imagine it can be overwhelming. And it makes me wonder what it is that sustains you in your work.
What re-energizes me is talking to our participants and being in the field and seeing just how transformed their lives are, how proud they are of their ability to transform their lives, and just their faces and the energy and the enthusiasm with which they are going about doing the elements of this program. That energizes me, and that is contagious. We don't work with everybody in the watershed. We work with about 60%, but we see an impact on the entire watershed. So that is very encouraging. that it is able to carry forward into the population, that whether it actually are direct participants, which is what you want.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically talking about the kind of growth that starts with sort of an initial investment, but then is self-reproducing, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Well, Earth Keepers has listeners from all over the world who tend to have one thing in common. They want to better love and serve creation. So I'm wondering, to that end, what's one thing you would hope listeners might take away from our conversation today?
I think if they take away anything is that it can't just be, I feel like what we talked about earlier, that siloed, we're just about the environment. You can't just be about the environment. You have to be about all of it at once. And change people's beliefs and change people's engagement and how they're talking about it. And so the environment is getting degraded because people are poor, right? Because people need the resources in ways that are exploitive. So if we continue to just restore the environment and not worry about the poverty, then we're going to end up in the same place where we are. So we need to both address the people element, the poverty, and the environment in order for the whole system to be restored. We're in the system whether we want to think of it as a system or not. So let's start thinking about it holistically.
It makes me wonder if the implication of what you're saying, say for the person who is listening from China or from El Salvador, if they begin to think more holistically, then that makes possible different sorts of work for the environment, different sorts of work to, I guess, be better earth keepers wherever they are. So no matter what their job is, they're, in a holistic sense, everyone has a part to play in their sphere of influence. Would that be a fair generalization to make?
Yes. I think that is what we need to understand. We're all involved within it, whether our involvement is intentional and progressive or not. So let's be involved in ways that are intentional and progressive.
We've been in conversation with Annah Amani, Africa Programs Officer for Plant with Purpose. If you want to learn more about her work and the work of Plant with Purpose in general, go to this episode's show notes. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Timothy Connor is our podcast editor. Our research assistant is Alex Megerly, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earth Keepers podcast.